the first time I saw his balcony hanging over my backyard. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because my brain needed about 5 seconds to protect me from how stupid the situation was. I stood there with a half-burned burger on my grill, staring up at this wooden frame sticking out over my lawn like my property line was just a polite suggestion, and I remember thinking, there is no way a grown man looked at this and said, "Yeah, that seems fine." But that was before I learned something about people like Preston Vale. Some folks do not cross lines because they do not see them. They cross them because they are betting you are too tired, too polite, or too scared to make them step back. I bought my house in the summer of 2020, right when everybody was pretending they suddenly knew how to bake bread and grow tomatoes. And honestly, I was not looking for anything fancy. I did not need a dramatic staircase or a kitchen island big enough to land a small aircraft. I just wanted space, quiet, and a backyard where I could sit at the end of the day without hearing someone argue through apartment walls about whose turn it was to take out the trash. The house was in a little town called Millstone Ridge, tucked about 40 minutes outside Raleigh. Not exactly postcard material, but it had old maple trees, sleepy streets, and neighbors who waved from driveways even when they had no idea who you were. The house itself was plain, white siding, blue shutters, a porch that creaked in 3 different emotional tones, but the backyard sold me. It was not huge, just wide enough to feel private, with a little slope near the fence and a patch of sunlight in the afternoon that made everything look warmer than it probably was. I remember standing back there during the showing with my real estate agent, Denise, who had this habit of calling every problem an opportunity, and I asked her 3 separate times where the property line was. She laughed the first time, then the second time she pulled out the survey, and by the 3rd time she said, "Evan, honey, I promise you, unless your future neighbor plans to build a castle, you are safe." Famous last words, right? I checked everything anyway, because I am that kind of person. Not paranoid exactly, just someone who learned early that paperwork is boring until it is the only thing standing between you and a disaster. I walked the boundary with the inspector, found the little metal pins in the dirt, took photos of them, saved the survey in a folder on my laptop, and when I finally signed the closing papers, I felt like I had done the adult version of building a fort around my peace. For almost 3 years that peace held. I had my routines, coffee on the back steps before work, mowing on Saturdays while listening to old country songs I would deny liking in public, and sometimes in the evening I would sit out there with a beer and just let the quiet do what quiet does, which is remind you that not everything in life needs to be fixed, answered, or defended. Then in early 2024, the house behind mine sold. I noticed the moving truck first, then the black SUV, then the guy in the fitted polo walking around the yard with the confidence of someone mentally knocking down walls before he even finds the light switches. His name was Preston Vale, mid-30s, sharp haircut, expensive watch, smile a little too practiced. The kind of smile that makes you check whether your wallet is still in your pocket, even though he has not done anything yet. He introduced himself over the back fence one Saturday afternoon while I was trimming a stubborn bush that had been personally insulting me for months. He said he was in residential redevelopment, which, as far as I could tell, meant he bought normal houses and turned them into places with too much glass and not enough soul. Still, he was friendly enough. He told me he liked the neighborhood, but thought the homes were underutilized, which is one of those phrases people use when they are about to make everyone else's life louder. I smiled, nodded, and said something neighborly like, "Well, welcome to the area." Then he pointed back at his house and said he was planning a renovation. Nothing crazy, just opening up the upstairs, extending the rear wall a bit, adding a modern balcony to take advantage of the view. I looked past him at the view, which was basically my maple tree, my fence, and the top of my grill cover. But I kept that to myself because I was raised right, and because I had not yet been given a reason to be difficult. A few weeks later, construction started. At first, it was the usual neighborhood renovation noise, saws whining, nail guns popping, workers yelling measurements at each other like they were trying to summon a demon with lumber. I told myself to be patient. People improve their homes, that is life, and I was not interested in becoming one of those neighbors who complains if a hammer falls before 9 a.m. But after a while, I started noticing little things. The new framing on Preston's second floor looked closer than it should have. Not just taller, not just bulkier, but angled toward my side of the fence in a way that made my stomach tighten before my brain could explain why. I would stand in my kitchen pretending to rinse a coffee mug while staring out the window like some suburban detective with dish soap on his hands. I kept telling myself perspective is weird. Angles lie. Do not be that guy. And then came the burger incident. It was a Thursday evening, warm, cloudy, the kind of weather where everything smells like cut grass and charcoal, and I was grilling dinner when I looked up and saw the skeleton of Preston's future balcony extending past the fence line. Not by an inch, not by some tiny trim piece, but enough that the shadow from the frame fell across my side of the yard. I actually stepped backward, like the thing had leaned toward me. I left the burger to die a smoky little death, then walked straight around to the construction entrance. One of the workers, a broad guy with a sunburned neck and a pencil behind his ear, was carrying boards near the back. I asked him, as calmly as I could, whether they had checked the property line for that balcony. He barely paused. He said, "We are building off the approved plans." "Ma'am," I said. "Approved by who? Because unless my backyard got annexed while I was at work, that frame is over my property." He gave me the look contractors give homeowners when they have already decided the homeowner is about to become a problem. Then he shrugged and said, "Talk to the owner." So I did. I knocked on Preston's front door, and when he opened it, he had that relaxed little grin, like he'd been expecting me, but had already decided how the conversation would end. I told him the balcony frame was crossing over my property line, not yelling, not accusing, just stating a fact. He leaned against the door frame and said, "Evan, it is just an overhang. It is not on your land." I remember blinking at him because that sentence was so confidently wrong it almost deserved its own award. I said, "Preston airspace is part of property. The boundary does not stop at the grass." He chuckled, actually chuckled, like I had just explained a conspiracy theory involving birds and taxes. "Come on," he said, "it is maybe a couple feet. You are not using that air." And I swear, for 1 second, I thought maybe I had misheard him. Because there are sentences so ridiculous they need to pass through your head twice before they become real. I said, "I am using it by owning it. That is kind of the whole point." His smile thinned then, not gone, just smaller, colder. He said, "Look, I get that change is uncomfortable, but this is a design feature. It is not hurting you. Do not turn a small thing into a neighborhood feud." And there it was. The little twist people use when they know they are wrong, but want you to feel guilty for noticing. I walked home with my jaw tight and my hands shaking in that quiet way. The way they do when you stay calm in front of someone but your body is already having the argument without you. That night, I pulled every document I had from closing. The survey, the title paperwork, the inspection photos. Even the old folder Denise had labeled boring but important. I spread it all across my kitchen table and sat under that harsh overhead light, measuring distances, comparing diagrams, zooming into photos of the boundary pins like I was analyzing evidence from a crime scene. Around midnight, my sister Claire called because I'd apparently texted her a blurry picture of a property marker with the message, "Am I insane?" She listened for 10 minutes, then said, "Evan, you are many things, but casually hallucinating balconies is not usually one of them." That made me laugh, which I needed, because underneath the absurdity was this ugly feeling I could not shake. It was not just the wood frame, it was the dismissal. It was the way Preston had said, "You were not using that hair." Like ownership only mattered if you personally approved how I used it. The next morning, I went outside before work with a tape measure, my phone, and the kind of determination that makes you forget coffee. I found the rear boundary pins again, measured from the fence, checked the survey against the actual yard, and then stood there staring up at the frame. It was over, clearly over, roughly 3 feet into the air above my backyard. 3 feet does not sound like much until someone takes it from you while smiling. I took photos from every angle, close, wide, from the side, from beneath it, with the measuring tape visible, with the fence in frame, with the maple tree behind it for reference. By the time I finished, my work shoes were wet from the grass, my shirt was sticking to my back, and I knew the truth in that cold, settled way. You know something before anyone official confirms it. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not perspective. This was a man building into my space because he thought I would fold before he had to move a single board. I called a licensed surveyor that afternoon, and when the receptionist asked how urgent the situation was, I looked out my office window, imagined that balcony getting finished one board at a time, and said, "Urgent enough that I'm willing to pay the fee that makes people stop apologizing for their schedule." 2 days later, A surveyor named Martin Hale showed up in a faded cap, with equipment that looked expensive enough to require its own seatbelt, and he walked the line with the calm patience of a man who had seen neighbors go to war over half a mailbox. He measured, marked, checked, measured again, and I stood there trying not to hover while absolutely hovering. Finally, he looked up at the balcony frame, then back down at his notes and said, "Well, Mr. Granger, you were right. That structure is encroaching into your property airspace by approximately 3 feet." He said it professionally, almost gently, but I felt it land like a gavel, because now it was not just my anger, it was not just my gut, it was documented. And once something becomes documented, the story changes. I called Preston that same afternoon and told him I had a licensed survey confirming the encroachment. There was a pause, short but real, and then he said, with this tired little sigh, "Evan, you really paid someone for that?" I said, "Yes, and I'm asking one more time to stop the work and pull the balcony back inside your property line." He got quiet again, then said, "I am not redesigning an entire project over a few feet of empty space." And that was when I realized we were no longer talking about a balcony. We were talking about power, about whether a person with money, confidence, and a construction crew could make a boundary disappear just by acting like it was beneath him. I told him my attorney would be contacting him. He laughed once, not loudly, not nervously, just enough to let me know he thought I was bluffing, and said, "Do what you have to do." So I did, and that is when the whole thing stopped being a weird neighbor dispute and started turning into the kind of fight neither of us could walk away from clean. The attorney I hired was named Marissa Cole, and I picked her because during our first call she did not gasp. She did not perform outrage. She did not say, "Wow, that is crazy," the way people do when they want to sound helpful but have no idea what to do next. She just asked 3 questions. Do you have the survey? Do you have photographs? And has construction continued after notice? When I said yes to the first 2 and probably to the third, she got quiet for a second and said, "Then we need to make the probably disappear." I liked her immediately. Her office was above a dentist on the older side of Millstone Ridge, the kind of building where the stairs creaked and every room smelled faintly like paper, coffee, and somebody else's expensive stress. I brought her everything, my closing documents, Martin's survey, photos from under the balcony frame, screenshots of texts with Preston, and a timeline I had made at 1:30 in the morning while eating dry cereal out of a mug, because apparently that is who I become under pressure. Marissa looked through the folder without much expression, which somehow made me more nervous than if she had reacted. Then she tapped the survey with her pen and said, "This is not a neighborly misunderstanding, Evan. This is an encroachment, and the longer he keeps building after he has been told, the uglier it gets for him." She drafted a certified notice that same day. Clean, formal, sharp enough to draw blood without raising its voice. It demanded that Preston stop all work on the rear balcony immediately, remove any portion extending beyond his legal boundary, and preserve all plans, communications, contractor notes, and permit documents related to the project. When she read that last part aloud, I asked why that mattered, and she looked at me over her glasses and said, "Because people who think they are clever often leave a paper trail proving they are not." The letter was delivered 2 days later. I know because I paid extra for confirmation, then refreshed the tracking page like it was the final score of a playoff game. At 11:42 a.m., it was signed for. At 12:17 p.m., I heard the nail guns start again. I remember standing in my kitchen with the tracking confirmation open on my phone, listening to those rhythmic cracks of construction from behind my house, and it felt less like noise and more like an answer. Preston had received the warning, understood exactly what it meant, and decided to keep going anyway. There is a special kind of anger that comes when someone does not just wrong you, but does it after you give them the chance to stop. It is colder than regular anger, cleaner somehow. That afternoon, I walked outside and saw workers installing joists on the very section we had just warned him about. One of them looked at me, then looked away fast, which told me more than any conversation could have. I called Marissa from the backyard, and over the sound of saws, I said, "They are still building." She said, "Take video." So I filmed the workers, the balcony frame, the boundary flags from Martin's survey still visible in the grass, the whole absurd scene of my property line being ignored in broad daylight like it had lost a popularity contest. That evening, Preston finally texted me, not called, of course, because calling would require sounding like a human being. His message said, "Evan, I have spoken with my team. The The project is permitted and proceeding. I do not appreciate threats being made through attorneys over a minor architectural feature. I stared at the phrase minor architectural feature for a full minute. My sister Claire, who had come over with takeout because she said I had reached the stage of legal conflict where vegetables were no longer optional, read it and said, "He talks like a brochure wearing cologne." She was right. I wanted to fire back something satisfying and deeply unprofessional, but Marissa had already warned me. No emotional texts, no insults, no late-night essays, no handing the other side a screenshot of you becoming the problem. So I wrote, "Please direct further communication to my attorney." Then I placed my phone face down like it might bite me. The next week was when the whole thing turned from private stress into neighborhood theater. People started noticing the flags in my yard. The surveyor stakes, the crews, the tension. Millstone Ridge was not a big place. And in a town like that, drama moves faster than official mail. My next-door neighbor, Gus Whitaker, a retired mailman who knew everybody's business before they did, leaned over the fence one morning and said, "Heard you and the fancy flip guy are having a little dust-up." I said, "If by dust-up you mean he's building part of his house into my airspace, then yes. We are basically in a Hallmark movie with zoning violations." Gus nodded like that made perfect sense and said, "I never trusted a man who wears loafers to look at lumber." The problem was, Preston was not acting embarrassed. If anything, he became more confident. He hosted contractors in his backyard like he was managing a kingdom, walking around with rolled plans in one hand and a coffee in the other, pointing at things, laughing loudly, making sure everyone could see how unbothered he was. And maybe that was what bothered me most. Not just the construction, but the performance of it. The way he seemed to be telling the whole neighborhood that I was just a fussy homeowner trying to block progress. One Saturday morning, he caught me taking photos and called across the fence, "You know, Evan, you are putting a lot of energy into being difficult." I lowered my phone and said, "I am putting energy into keeping my property mine." He smiled, that thin little developer smile, and said, "Sometimes communities grow when people stop clinging to outdated lines." I actually laughed then, because what else do you do when a man tries to turn trespassing into personal development? I said, "Preston, it is a boundary line, not a bad habit." His face changed for just half a second. The mask slipped, and I saw the irritation underneath. He said, "You are not going to win this." "The town approved my renovation." I said, "The town did not approve you owning my backyard." He stepped closer to the fence and said, "You have no idea how expensive redesigning this would be." There it was. Not community, not progress, not architecture, money, delay, ego. He had built himself into a corner and decided the cheapest exit was through me. Marissa filed for a temporary injunction 2 days later. She also recommended a second survey, not because Martin's work was weak, but because, as she put it, judges like independent repetition, and stubborn men hate it. The second surveyor was a woman named Priya Nair, and she did not waste a single movement. It came with a tablet, a total station, bright orange markers, and the energy of someone who could find the edge of a cloud if you gave her enough time. She marked the legal boundary again, photographed the balcony from multiple measured points, and produced a report even more direct than Martin's. The rear balcony framing projected approximately 3 feet and 2 inches into my protected airspace, and the encroachment was not decorative trim, it was structural. 3 feet and 2 inches. Funny how numbers can make you feel both vindicated and sick. The temporary hearing was scheduled for late May. But before we even got there, Marissa received the first real break. Preston's contractor, the sunburned guy with the pencil behind his ear, called her office. His name was Wade Larkin, and apparently he had been losing sleep. Or maybe he had been afraid of being dragged into a lawsuit, which is its own kind of moral awakening. Either way, he told Marissa there were internal notes from the framing stage showing the crew had flagged the boundary issue. According to Wade, one of his guys noticed the balcony projection did not match the setback assumptions, and when they raised it with Preston, Preston told them to keep going because changing the design would delay completion and jeopardize a buyer showcase he had planned for later that summer. A buyer showcase. That was the first time I understood the bigger picture. Preston was not renovating that house because he loved Millstone Ridge. He was turning it into a luxury listing, some glossy modern retreat with a balcony view, and my backyard had become part of the product without my consent. When Marissa told me, I did not say anything for a while. I just sat in my truck outside her office, both hands on the steering wheel, staring at the brick wall across the parking lot. It is strange. the moment you realize someone did not accidentally step on you. They measured you, priced the inconvenience, and decided you were cheaper than doing things right. At the injunction hearing, Preston arrived in a navy suit and that same calm expression, like he was attending a ribbon cutting instead of defending why his balcony was hanging over another man's yard. His attorney argued that construction was nearly complete, that stopping now would create financial hardship, that the encroachment was minimal, that there was no practical harm because no posts touched the ground. Marissa stood up and, in the driest voice I'd ever heard, said, "Your Honor, my client is not required to wait until a post is planted in his lawn before his property rights matter." I wanted to stand and applaud, but I had been told to behave like a normal adult, so I just stared at the table and tried not to smile. The judge reviewed the surveys, the photos, the certified notice, the continued construction, and then he asked Preston's attorney one question. Was your client aware of the alleged encroachment before construction continued? The attorney hesitated, just slightly, but in a courtroom, a slight hesitation feels like someone dropped a plate. He said they disputed the legal significance of the overhang. The judge said, "That was not my question." And for the first time since I had met him, Preston looked genuinely uncomfortable. The temporary injunction was granted. All work on the balcony had to stop immediately until the case was resolved. No finishing, no enclosing, no modifying. No clever little adjustments done over a weekend when nobody was looking. Preston walked past me afterward in the hallway and muttered, "Congratulations, you just cost me 6 figures. I looked at him and said, "No, Preston, you did that when you tried to sell my air as your view." He stopped walking for a second, and I thought he might say something ugly, something that would finally reveal the real person under all that polish, but he just swallowed it and kept going. That should have felt like a win. In some ways it did. The nail guns stopped. The trucks stopped. My backyard got quiet again, but the balcony frame was still there, frozen mid-violation, casting its crooked shadow every afternoon, like a reminder that stopping damage is not the same as undoing it. And by then, Larissa had already warned me. Temporary orders are just the opening round. The real fight would come when we asked the court to make him take it down for good. By the time the final hearing came around, the balcony had been sitting there unfinished for almost 2 months, which somehow made it worse than if it had been completed, because every time I walked into my backyard, I was looking at a mistake that had been paused but not corrected. Like somebody had hit freeze on disrespect. The boards had started to weather at the edges. The exposed beams were turning grey in spots, and when the afternoon sun came over Preston's roofline, that frame still threw a long crooked shadow across my grass, almost like it was reminding me that the court could stop the work, but it could not give me back the months I had spent thinking about it while brushing my teeth, while driving to work, while trying to enjoy dinner with my sister, while pretending I was not slowly becoming the guy who knew way too much about property airspace. Marissa told me before the hearing that the facts were strong. But strong facts do not always mean an easy day, because court has a way of making obvious things feel fragile until a judge says them out loud. I wore the only suit I owned, which still had a funeral mint in the pocket from 3 years earlier, and Claire insisted on coming with me because, in her words, every family needs at least one person in the gallery silently judging the villain. Preston arrived with his attorney and 2 thick binders, looking polished, rested, and annoyed in that expensive way, like the legal system itself had inconvenienced his schedule. He did not look at me at first. Then, right before we went in, he leaned close enough that only I could hear and said, "You know, this could have been handled like neighbors." I looked at him and said, "Neighbors ask before they hang a balcony over your yard." He gave me that tight smile again, but this time it did not work as well. Inside the courtroom, everything felt smaller than I expected. Not grand, not cinematic in the way movies train you to imagine, just fluorescent lights, wood benches, a seal on the wall, and a judge who looked like he had heard every possible version of people insisting the rules should bend just this once. Marissa went first, and she did exactly what she had done from the beginning. No drama, no speech, no emotional fireworks, just one clean brick of evidence after another. She showed the original closing survey from when I bought the house, and Martin's survey, then Pryor's independent report, then the photographs with the measuring tape, the boundary flags, the unfinished frame, the certified notice, the time-stamped videos of construction continuing after Preston had signed for the letter. She did not call Preston greedy. She did not call him arrogant. She did not need to. She just built the timeline so carefully that by the end, The only reasonable story left was the real one. He knew, he continued, and he expected me to either give up or be treated like the unreasonable one for objecting. Preston's attorney tried to soften it, of course. He talked about proportionality, hardship, investment-backed expectations, and how the projection was minimal, only a few feet of unused airspace above a residential yard. When he said unused airspace, Claire made a tiny sound behind me that was either a cough or the first stage of a felony, and I kept my eyes forward. Then Marissa stood and said, unused by whom? Counsel, because ownership is not measured by whether the trespasser finds the owner's use impressive enough. The judge looked down at his notes, and for a second I thought he might smile, but he kept it together better than I did. The biggest moment came when Wade Larkin, the contractor, was called in. He looked nervous, not terrified, just worn down, like a man who had spent too many nights realizing a paycheck was not worth becoming Exhibit A. He testified that during framing, one of his crew members noticed the rear projection appear to cross the expected boundary line. He said they raised it with Preston, and Preston asked what it would take to change it. Wade told him redesigning the balcony would require new drawings, new structural review, delays, and additional cost. Then Marissa asked, and what did Mr. Vaillant instruct you to do after that? Wade looked at Preston, then at the judge, and said, he told us to keep going. The room went still in that way courtrooms do when something important lands quietly. Preston's attorney tried to clean it up, asking whether Wade was a lawyer, whether he could determine legal boundaries, whether construction crews often dealt with uncertain field conditions. But the damage was done. Wade did not need to be a lawyer. He only needed to confirm that the problem had been spotted, discussed, and ignored. When Preston finally testified, he tried to sound reasonable. He said he believed the permits covered the project, that the overhang was not intended to harm anyone, that he had invested significant money, that removing it would be wasteful and punitive. For a moment, I almost understood how people like him convince themselves they are the victim, because in his mind, the real injury was not that he crossed my line. It was that I refused to absorb the cost of his decision. The judge asked him directly, after receiving the certified notice and survey, why did you continue construction? Preston paused, and you could almost see him searching for a version of the truth that made him look better. Finally, he said, I believed Mr. Granger was exaggerating the issue. The judge looked at him and said, 2 license surveys are not an exaggeration. That was the sentence that finally let me breathe. The ruling came after a short recess, though it felt long enough for me to mentally age into a different tax bracket. The judge found that the balcony constituted a continuing encroachment into my protected property space, that Preston had actual notice before continuing construction, and that financial inconvenience did not justify a private taking of a neighbor's rights. He ordered the encroaching portion removed entirely, not trimmed, not negotiated, not compensated into existence, removed. Preston was also ordered to reimburse my survey costs, a portion of my attorney fees, and damages for the period of interference. I wish I could tell you I felt triumphant, like I walked out into the sunlight with music swelling behind me. But the truth is, I just felt tired. Relieved, yes, but tired in my bones. Because winning did not give me something extra. It just forced a man to return what he should never have tried to take. The demolition happened 3 weeks later. Gus set up a lawn chair on his patio like it was the 4th of July parade, and Claire brought coffee and said she was there for emotional support and light gloating. I watched from my back steps as the crew returned, including Wade, and this time they were not carrying boards up, they were bringing them down. First the rail sections, then the decking, then the outer beams, one piece at a time. The balcony that had once looked so permanent coming apart under the same hands that had built it. Preston stayed inside for most of it, but near the end, I saw him standing behind his glass back door, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He did not wave. I did not either. There was nothing left to perform. When the last beam came down, the yard changed instantly, not in some magical movie way, but in a small physical way that hit me harder than I expected. The sunlight reached the grass cleanly again. The fence looked like a fence again, not a line under negotiation. My maple tree threw the only shadow that belonged there. Gus raised his coffee cup and said, well, looks like gravity sided with you. I laughed for the first time in weeks, without feeling like I had to force it. Later that evening, after everyone left and the yard was quiet, I sat on the back step with a beer and looked at the open space above my lawn. The same empty air. Preston had acted like nobody could own. nobody could use, nobody should defend. And I thought about how easy it is for people to call something small when they are the ones taking it. 3 feet, a shadow, a view, a line on a survey. It all sounds minor until it is yours, until someone stands there smiling and tells you that your boundary is inconvenient to their plans. So no, this was never really about a balcony. It was about the moment you decide whether peace means staying quiet or standing up before quiet turns into permission. And I still wonder what would have happened if I had ignored it, if I had laughed it off, if I had let him keep those 3 feet just to avoid being called difficult. Would it have ended there? Or would the next person have learned that my line could move if they pushed hard enough? I do not know, but I know this much. Every neighborhood has fences, surveys, sidewalks, and property markers. But the real boundaries are tested when someone decides they matter less than what they want. So I want to ask you, if you had been standing in that backyard, looking up at someone else's balcony hanging over your space, would you have fought it the way I did? Or would you have let it go to keep the peace? Was I protecting what was mine? Or did I take a few feet too far? Drop your opinion in the comments, because I promise you, the answer feels a lot simpler when you are not the one standing under the shadow. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor who treated your patience like permission, share this story and stick around. Because trust me, the suburbs may look quiet, but some of the wildest battles happen right over the fence.